Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Claudia Silk, the Adult Services Librarian at the Fairfield Public Library, and we're so pleased to be partnering with the League of Women Voters this evening. Both of our organizations share a mission to combat misinformation by providing factual information. This evening's program is our first joint program, and we are pleased to welcome you all. I am now going to turn this program over to the League Vice President, Bryce Perry.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you to the Fairfield Public Library for their collaboration with the League of Women Voters in this session of our series, Spotlight on Redistricting and Your Vote. When developing our fall program, the Fairfield League determined that issues that we're confronted with today are too complex to be fully explored in one session. So thus our series concept was born. Our first session, Redistricting, It's Your Vote They're Talking About, featured popular author David Daley and Joan Twiggs, champion for the League of Women Voters' People-Powered Fair Maps. It was both interesting and informative. Our second session, Redistricting, How Is It Done and Why Is It Important, was masterminded by Fairfield University professors and students and presented 3 different mapping scenarios. It was so well done. We're working on session 4 now, and we'll have more information to follow, but I have high expectations that it's going to be special. Tonight's part 3 of our series, Redistricting in the News. The program will center on developments to date, perspectives and maps, what becomes news, transparency, and public participation. Our panelists include Ken Dixon, politics editor of Hearst, Connecticut Media, Mark Pazniokas, I practiced that, Capitol Bureau Chief and co-founder of the Connecticut Mirror, Dr. Kyle Evans, visiting assistant professor of mathematics at Trinity College in Hartford, and Cheri Quickmire, executive director of Common Cause in Connecticut. What an impressive panel. Welcome and thank you all for joining us. Each panelist will present for about 15 minutes, and at the end, I'll ask some questions submitted by both the League and viewers who submitted questions when registering. We'll start tonight with Ken Dixon. I'll ask the other panelists to please mute themselves during others' presentations. Thank you. Ken Dixon is a politics editor for Hearst, Connecticut Media. A graduate of Stanford High School, Ken Dixon began his newspaper career covering coal mine strike in southeastern Ohio as an undergraduate at Ohio University in Athens, where he earned a journalism degree in 1976. In mid-1977, after a brief stint as a farm editor in London, Ohio, Dixon joined the Telegram and the Bridgeport Post here in Connecticut. In 1994, after a 5-year stint as a daily columnist, Dixon began covering the state capitol, government, and politics. His work has been recognized by both the State and National Society of Professional Journalists, the National Press Club, and the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, which gave him awards this year in the categories of crisis commentary and social justice for Hearst, Connecticut Media, which includes the daily newspapers in Bridgeport, New Haven, Greenwich, Stamford, Norwalk, I sound like the train conductor, Danbury, Middletown, and Torrington. Dixon was inducted into the Connecticut Journalism Hall of Fame in 2019. And with further ado, I will turn it over now to Mr. Ken Dixon. Thank you.
Thanks. That introduction is probably longer than I want to talk about redistricting. What's the news? The news is what we print, and what we print has been perfunctory votes after closed door negotiations between Democrats and Republicans who are looking to keep their seats, and they have developed what can be called interesting attempts at redrawing the maps for the state house and Senate districts. They have thus far failed to redraw the congressional lines, but self-interest is really the most important thing for elected officials in the General Assembly, and they'll get around to it I'm sure before the December 21st deadline that they established for themselves. They're usually late. They're late this year. They've got a semi-decent excuse because the April the census every 10 years shows up around April, and this one didn't show up till August. So they were already way behind a deadline under a reapportionment commission made up of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans that failed to make the deadline. So they've reconstituted themselves, called themselves a reapportionment commission with a ninth member, former Republican Senate Minority Leader from Westport named John McKinney. And it's, as far as transparency goes, I'm sure Cheri and Mark will give you their side of that also. It makes opaque look like there's some light shining through. These guys are behind closed doors. They're trading maps. They're turning Senate districts that used to be Westport heading north. It's got the strangest appendage going west through southern Duquesne and northern Darien to get to a Democratic part of Stamford. And having grown up in Stamford, I don't think I got to Westport until I was a sophomore in high school on a losing soccer team that Kyle might know about, Staples High School in Westport. It hasn't been very satisfactory, and if they look at the congressional maps, you have to push the 2nd district from Eastern Connecticut. It's got to pick up 20,000 some odd people, so everything's got to push west. I've seen maps that make it pretty easy to make 5 congressional districts, but it doesn't seem like easy is what they want. I'd be interested in knowing, I can't tell the people here what kind of input the sitting members of Congress have had behind the scenes. I guess they've had some kind of contact with party leaders, and party leaders talk to the members of the commission, which are leaders of the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats. And really the name of this game is to protect incumbents. At least, we're not North Carolina, we're not Ohio with the legislature making Republican districts stronger and Democratic districts less strong. But if I was living in my old neighborhood in Belltown and Stamford, and I wanted to run as an independent, it'd be pretty interesting collecting signatures across that district to petition on it. If you're following along, you probably noticed that I don't really have a presentation per se. I'm interested in questions and dealing with this on a daily basis. It's, I read the Times, and thankfully we're not North Carolina, but it's all about incumbency up there this year. And I think I'll stop prattling at this point.
Thank you, Ken. Now we'll move on to Mark Pazniokas. Mark is the Capitol Bureau Chief and co-founder of Connecticut Mirror, a nonprofit news organization that has been covering politics and public policy in Connecticut since its website went live on January 25th, 2010. His work can be read at connecticutmirror.org and often is republished by newspapers under a license agreement. He was a staff writer at the Hartford Courant for 24 years, covering Hartford City Hall, the state capitol, and state politics and federal courts. He also is a former staff writer at the Journal Inquirer and a former contributor to the New York Times. He's a graduate of Boston University, and we welcome him now. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for having me. Covering reapportionment is really unlike anything else that Ken and I do. As Ken noted, it is in the best of times, it's an opaque process. More so this time, we had the complication of COVID, which not only delayed the delivery of the census that is necessary to begin this, but it also allowed or encouraged the commission itself and the committee that preceded it to meet remotely. They did have public hearings. They drew limited interest. This was unlike 10 years ago when there was some agitation by groups to look at whether or not the Senate map, for example, could be drawn to provide a district that would be amenable to the election of a Hispanic candidate. We didn't have that kind of lobbying this year. The lobbying was fairly limited. You had the League of Women Voters and Common Cause really talking about process, about trying to open it. That did not occur. And then you had lobbying by certain communities. The good folks of Wilton decided they really had nothing in common with Norwalk, and they wanted to see a House district based there. They succeeded in that effort. Those were sort of the things that were done in the public. One of the good things about the General Assembly is you can see all the testimony that is filed. You can see maps that people were encouraged to submit. And I applaud Common Cause for having a gallery of those maps. And I know Kyle Evans will talk about his class's work. I've talked to him a couple of times about that because his class has certainly done maps, congressional maps that make much more sense than I think what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks from the commission. Covering this really is about anticipation. Since there was so little that you could really cover that was public, it was a little bit like covering elements of the budget, particularly this very important, somewhat esoteric thing known as the Budget Implementer Bill, which is a mechanism that the legislature can settle scores, enacts significant policies that could not get through the general session. And what that has in common with reapportionment is if you're a reporter covering this, you have to anticipate. You have to talk to people. You have to get a sense of what the gossip is when it comes to reapportionment maps. Who's in trouble? Who has annoyed the leadership? Who is vulnerable? This year, I knew that because of population losses, it will be interesting to see if Hartford was going to maintain its 6 districts. You will hear people talk about how many districts are in a town, but really what the politicians are interested in and what indicates where the power is how many districts are really based in those communities. How many districts are drawn in a way in which, in the case of Hartford, where you can reasonably expect somebody from Hartford to dominate that district. So they did some creative things this time. So you talk about anticipation. I was looking for how they would handle the Hartford map. Given that the Speaker of the House, Matt Ritter, is from Hartford, I had every reason to believe that Hartford would be protected to the degree possible. And in fact, that was the case. There was some creativity. One of the Hartford districts crosses the Connecticut River for the first time, apparently in the history of Connecticut, and it reaches fairly deeply into South Windsor to make the numbers work because Hartford, again, they were losing population, so they had to reach out. You knew to look in Stamford, would they, how would the Senate districts be accommodated there? The good news for Stamford is they now have a share of 3 districts. The bad news is is a accident of geography. Stanford is going to be the only of the largest 4 cities that does not have 2 Senate districts. They're geographically based there. They can reasonably expect to elect somebody from their city. The problem in Stanford, it's now the 2nd largest city, but because of the geography, it's tucked down in that corner of Connecticut where it has Greenwich on one side, water, and then New York on the other. So there's really not a lot you can do there to really give Stanford its due and break it into 2 and make it the base for 2 Senate districts. The other things to look for were, what were going to be the surprises? What were the oddities? And I have to say, I am not a big fan of social media. I'm not a big fan of Twitter. I find it to be pretty toxic these days, but every now and then it's useful. And the day that the House map came out and then the Senate map came out, I found Twitter pretty useful because you got to see people reacting in real time. I could only anticipate so much. We are talking about 151 districts. I knew, for example, that Annie Hughes, the leader of the House Progressive Caucus, who some of her colleagues find annoying at times, and there was not an effort. I did not anticipate there was going to be an effort to protect her. And indeed, her district, when I talked to her, her first question was, is my house still in the district? Because I think her backyard is pretty much on the edge of it. But on Twitter, you got to see people react in real time. So when these maps come out, you try to do the basics of a story that can grow as you go through the 151 districts and you learn more. And that's the process the day the map came out for me. You got a story up within an hour, and then you add to it as you learn things, as you do more analysis. Some of the oddities in the House map, and they build on Ken Dixon's very relevant point about the power of incumbency. There was certainly trading of districts. The Republicans, for example, negotiated a new district for Craig Fishbein. Craig Fishbein won by 7 votes. The gentleman he beat by 7 votes no longer lives in his district. The trade-off there was 2 nearby districts that are held by Democrats, but they were more competitive. Those districts became more Democratic. So Craig Fishbein got rid of an opponent who only beat by 7 votes. The trade-off for that is Liz Lanahan in Cheshire and Michael Quinn in Meriden. They were able to shed parts of their districts that were friendlier to Republicans. So are these things that suit democracy, that promote competitive races? No, but this is always the way it's been in Connecticut. And again, when you're covering it, that's the kind of analysis you're looking at. To create the new Wilton House District, there was again, the Republicans wanted that. The trade-off is in Eastern Connecticut, where there was a loss of population, they basically took the 42nd district, represented by a guy named Mike France, and blew it up. Gave the pieces of it to other districts, and the 42nd, which used to be based in Ledyard, is now based in Wilton. Again, to reinforce Ken's point about the degree to that incumbency shapes this, when I had asked the leaders of the House in both parties, was any incumbent written out of a district, they said no. And what they really meant was no incumbent who was seeking re-election was written out of a district, because Mike France, if he's running for Congress, but if he changed his mind and decided to run for re-election, he doesn't really have a seat right now. He does not live in what was once the 42nd district. Then the other things that, again, the oddities that you might get a glimpse of. I noticed shortly before the map came out that a state rep from Bristol named Whit Betts announced he was not running. So I put that on my list to see what happened to that district. And indeed, that district was redrawn in a way to accommodate one of his colleagues, Kara Pavlak D'Amato, who had actually bought a house in a different district. And because of Whit Betts's retirement, they were able to redraw the district to accommodate her. So those are the things you look for when you are a reporter. There was not, you also try to explain the process, which is obviously important to Common Cause and the League of Women Voters. And in fact, I talked to Professor Evans about that tonight because I am looking at what's coming up next on the congressional stuff. So again, to wrap up, it is an opaque process. It is always a challenge to cover, and really very much more so this time around due to the pandemic and the physical inability to get hold of some of these people. It was, by the way, the 8 members, the legislators who sit on the commission, when the state house map was voted on, only 4 people had ever seen it, so there were 9 people, only 4 of them had seen it, because that's how it works. You break the commission into 2 pieces. The 4 House people work on the House maps and the senators do theirs. So literally the day that they all voted on it, there were only 4 people of the 9 who voted on it who had even seen the damn map they voted on. So I think I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, I think. All interesting stuff. Next up is Dr. Kyle Evans, and Kyle is a visiting assistant professor of mathematics at Trinity College in Hartford. Prior to joining Trinity, Kyle completed his PhD in math with a research focus on education from the University of Connecticut in 2018. Kyle is the co-founder of Math Teachers Circle for Social Justice, and his research interests and passion are in rehumanizing mathematics and changing the undergraduate mathematics experience through meaningful content, dynamic pedagogy, and metacognitive assessment. His interest in redistricting stems from a personal love of maps and mathematics, and he created a mathematics and redistricting course at Trinity that he regularly teaches. I also was able to see the webinar, Kyle, that you did with the geographers. And I have to say your presentation was phenomenal, and math and maps actually do go together. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And if you could allow me to screen share it, that would be good. It says it's disabled. Let's see. Okay, thank you. So yes, I do have some similar information as I did in the past, but I did just want to take a few minutes and quickly to at least talk about some of the more common mathematical approaches and how that has sort of scaled up recently. As really the professional researching mathematics community has really taken such an interest in this in the last decade, this issue. And I think it's become more accessible, I think, with the rise of big data. And I feel like mathematicians, when they see these problems and these inequities, like the human nature, I think, or mathematical nature, is to try to solve these problems. And of course, as we sort of know, and just hearing a lot of these sort of stories, and when you sort of uncover what's actually happening behind closed doors, it's not such an easy problem to solve, right? Especially when you bring in these human conversations and these human elements, those sorts of things can be hard to quantify. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And also I want to talk a little bit about my class as well. So just in terms of a couple of mathematical things, yeah, like if you did see my presentation a few months ago, some of this will look familiar, but just some basic ideas. I mean, you can, of course, like when you look, one of the first things people notice, right, when they look at the districts is of course, their physical shape. And so, we have a wide variety of what we would call these compactness tests and ways to try to, talk about the geometry and quantify the geometry. And of course, you have to be careful, and you need to be contextualizing, like what if this district has a weird shape because it's the Atlantic Ocean, right? Like, so sometimes you just need to be a little bit careful, but I mean, these are just some examples. I'm not going to go into the mathematical details. Of course, you could always, look some of these up later or look through the slides or recording or things like that. And just for my personal, little fun anecdote, I intentionally picked some districts across the country that make it look like it spells the word love here on the bottom, because I thought that was a nice little touch. So geometry is certainly one way that mathematicians feel like, okay, we can do something, we can quantify these shapes. But of course, that's only one element, right? And so the idea is to have sort of a wide variety of tools in your toolbox. And this is, of course, what I do with my students as well when I turn this into a semester-long course. And so, you also are going to have this sort of, relatively simple notion of what we call the efficiency gap, which tries to quantify like how much of an advantage a political party has. And so it's all based on this idea of a wasted vote. And the idea being that, it doesn't matter which party we're talking about, but let's say, for example, the Democrats were to win a district in a landslide. And the idea being that, well, maybe that's not a good use of their voters, so to speak, because, again, it's winner take all, and you only need to have a simple majority, right? So anything above, 50% plus one voter is more than you need. And so the idea being, well, maybe if we were trying to manipulate the map for our party's gain, that we would try to distribute the voters in such a way that they could, maximize their effectiveness, right? Be efficient about it. And similarly, right, if we lose a district by a really close margin, then maybe that's, maybe those voters were better off somewhere else. And so this is, again, just sort of a mathematical way to, and this is sort of like I would say like step one, if we want to try to quantify like how much a political party has an advantage. And again, there's a lot of different, more complicated metrics out there, but this is one of the more simple ones. And it does have some pull, I think, in the sense that it's easier for the public to understand. And this was something that came up in some of the Supreme Court cases in the last 5 years as well. And, just to give you an example of maybe taking not a step 2, maybe a step 1.5, here is just another formula that, and another metric that, I'm showing you also the ones that are sort of the most commonly, used or accepted in this field. But just this idea of, using a statistical distribution and comparing the mean to a median. And again, this is just another attempt of trying to quantify a political party's advantage. Okay. And these are, of course, all these things that you can do on real maps and not just, little toy examples that I've created here. And the good news is that in, the free web software that's out there, such as Dave's Redistricting, which is what I use in my class and many people use to draw maps, that these programs also will calculate these things for you. So you don't need to, break out a pen and a pencil and a calculator and whip together these formulas. Of course, it is nice to understand what they mean and how to interpret them. But a lot of these are just, based on this notion of some sort of statistical test and seeing if there is something that's significant and that would sort of beg some level of manipulation on the map. Okay. And where this has really scaled up to, and what I would say is the most commonly used approach in the field today, is what we would call this outlier analysis. And this is also based on, some statistical distribution. And this is only, something that's probably, become widely used in the last 5 years, I would say, especially in the most recent Supreme Court case involving North Carolina. But I would say the main set of tools now is these sort of algorithmic approaches, where the idea is that you build a computer algorithm to, create some sort of a large distribution. The word ensemble is often used for this. And so you can set it up in such a way that you're putting all these restrictions in there. And so this is going to be state specific. So for example, in Connecticut, what guides our process other than, in terms of the physical geography, what often guides the process more than anything else is following the town borders. And so the idea is that you can set up an algorithm in such a way that, whether you're doing a congressional, a state senate, a state house, you're like, okay, take all of these census blocks in the state, split them up in a way that populations are roughly equal, that follow town borders as much as possible, and create, 20,000, for example, random maps that would satisfy, that could be potential maps. And the idea of why we would do this is because there would be effectively an infinite amount of maps you could possibly draw, and we can't analyze all the possibilities. And so the idea is we use these algorithmic approaches to build like a representative sample of possibilities. And then if we're looking at a particular map, such as the one that was passed or somebody proposed, we would compare that within a distribution and see if that would be, expected, or would that be like really an outlier compared to all reasonable possibilities. And you could, create these thousands of random maps, and you could compute anything you want. So for example, what's often used, in these Supreme Court cases with these controversial states, like North Carolina, Ohio, and these kinds of things, is, you might create all these thousands of random congressional maps, and then you might say, okay, in all these possibilities, how many of the districts are likely to be won by Democrats versus Republicans, using the recent, voter history of various regions. And then you could see, well, okay, we create this expected distribution of what could happen, how many districts that Democrats or Republicans can win. And then we see, okay, so this map that is being proposed, where does that fall? Is that within the reasonable expectation, or is this really an outlier? And that, of course, would suggest some level of gerrymandering or manipulation. You could also, again, you could calculate it whatever you want. You could set up your algorithm or your program to say, generate these things, calculate this thing, compare. And, so this could be done for minority representation. It could be done for the geometry. It could be done for, like another formula I showed you. And I guess in the case of Connecticut, and this is some analysis I hope to be a part of very shortly, actually, is trying to produce analysis that talks about these incumbents. And, Mark shared these stories with us. And we also can apply this idea in a statistical analysis and say, well, let's create maybe a reasonable distribution of Connecticut state house or Senate maps, and maybe say, okay, if we sort of overlay the incumbent addresses, we could see, well, in all these possibilities, how many districts are contained an incumbent, and where does the actual map that was passed lie within that distribution. And this is just a picture from the North Carolina one, but again, statistical distribution, outlier is what they actually passed, because this was a heavily gerrymandered map in North Carolina. You can also do these kinds of things in the program. You can compare, your map that you draw in the program to a number of others in the distribution. And so I want to make a comment about that. I want to go back to that incumbency notion in a second. I just want to point out a couple of things about the Connecticut census data, and before I show a couple of pictures of the past House districts, some specific districts. But as we sort of know and has been talked about, the Connecticut population shifts were mostly concentrated in Fairfield County. And so of course that's going to shift, some of the district borders a little bit. The overall state population didn't change that much. I will say, our diversity metrics sort of increased. And that might just be about the way that people were reporting in terms of multiracial, because that went up by a vast number. But that's good in terms of equitable representation. And just in terms of our ideal populations, just to give this a little bit of sense, right? Our congressional districts that are going to be drawn shortly are going to have about 721,000 people in them. And our Senate and House districts that were recently passed, each have an average of 100,000 or 23,000. And here's our top 5 towns now based on the census data. As Mark said, Stamford moved up to now the second most populous city in Connecticut. And these are the only 5 that even have above 100,000 population. And you see my note here about this adjusted for prison population, right? And so I don't want to overlook that, because it is really important. And it's important to mention that in the congressional maps that we're awaiting for, that new law reallocating prison populations does not apply to those congressional districts. That new law only applies to the state house and state senate districts that were just passed. And so when we were looking, and this was just passed in May 2021, that Connecticut became the 11th state to adjust their census counts, right? And so what that means, that simply was basically previously, and actually, like I said, is still the case for our congressional maps, that the people that are, in our prison facilities in Connecticut are technically counted as a resident of the town with the prison, but the adjustment says actually we move them back to their home communities. And so that definitely had impact on especially the state house districts, because the size of them is smaller. And of course, it doesn't have as much of an impact on a congressional district with 720,000 people. But at the end of the day, I mean, every person matters. And if the goal is equitable representation, then it's important. And I just want to mention here that in terms of reallocating those populations, that Waterbury was the town whose population shifted the most, in the sense that if I go back here, Waterbury's official census population is over 114,000, but their population for the purposes of redistricting on the state level adds an extra over 1,000 people to that, because people that were incarcerated elsewhere around the state that are from Waterbury got reallocated back to Waterbury. And as you see on the opposite hand, that the top 5 towns that lost population are, of course, the towns where some of these facilities exist, right? So Enfield's population decreased by 2,000 because the people who were in the facilities there were now not counting there, right? And so we did see some shifts in the size of the districts that did previously contain those towns. So that's one really important thing to notice, to take into account when we were talking about our state level maps versus our congressional maps, about the big legislative change, where this is again something they did for the first time this cycle. And then in terms of fair maps, like I mentioned, if we're really looking at, and if we want to take an algorithmic approach, or even if we want to try to compute things, or how do we determine, what is fair, what is not fair? And that's sort of what has very much become the theme of my course as well. It's just around this notion of fairness, which is not really a well-defined term. And there are many things you could look at. I mean, like I said, compactness or geometry, it's maybe not the best from a numerical perspective, especially when you have town borders, and town borders aren't always nice shapes, and especially if they border the ocean. Maybe the eye test, that's most mathematicians would cringe there, but in reality, the eye test maybe is an acceptable form of this, and we can definitely see some strange shapes or strange parts of shapes on some of our new districts. Town splits, I mean, it's something that's easy to count, but we need to be careful, as many of these are necessary for population equality, and minimizing that might not be practical for various reasons. If we look at our partisan lean over the last 3 legislative sessions in Connecticut, we have seen more of these districts in the House and Senate become Democratic. But it also begs the question of, what is the goal? And as Mark said, in terms of the incumbents, it seems like, right, what actually happens behind closed doors is the idea of protecting seats and making them, maybe less competitive. And so that's a question, right? Are we trying, in terms of analyzing this, maybe we look at how many districts are what we would call politically competitive, and how has that changed, right? Or did people just get, lucky to be in a position of power on an election that ended in the year of 0 to be a part of this process? And, as we've sort of talked about here, is what seems to be the result of these maps is, I've heard this fun new term, incumbent-mander, instead of gerrymander, to basically protect these incumbents. And like I said, this is something that I expect to be working on very soon and be a part of, producing some sort of analysis that looks about, the likelihood of this, the fact that they really did manage these negotiations to give everybody their district. And this is not by any means super rigorous at this point, but I just want to point out 5 spots where there are people that are very much on the edge of their district. So for example, these are the new districts, by the way, that just passed. So District 147 in Stamford, this was one where I see this rep who is, again, this is the incumbent. This is, marking where they live in the district, is very much on the edge. That edge also happens to be a town border, so it makes sense. But because Stamford has multiple districts, it says, it really says, okay, well, how did they carve out this district to include this particular representative as opposed to the neighboring districts, right? District 142 down in Norwalk and New Canaan, we can see where the district, where the current rep lives there. And that's very much across a town border. So you can see they just put this funny little part on the top of it to stretch into New Canaan. And that's conveniently where that incumbent lives, okay? Where the rest of that 142, that main section is Norwalk, okay? District 100 in Middletown, that flag is right on the border. This person's street and backyard is the border. this district. So Middletown has parts of 2 districts, but which part of it carves like right through the downtown strip, the main street of Middletown. And won't forget which part. One of this has Wesleyan and the other part doesn't have Wesleyan. But this district was definitely and obviously intentionally carved out that this guy's street is the border of District 1, our new District 100. District 5, this was something that I was honing in on a little bit because like I said, I teach at Trinity in Hartford. So I'm based in Hartford. So with Hartford's changing population, we were definitely keeping an eye on what was going to happen here. And, you know, we knew because of what's happening behind closed doors that they weren't going to squeeze out an incumbent. And so what they just basically did in terms of Brandon McGee in Hartford was, again, just keep his address just on the edge of District 5, and they expanded it in other directions into South Windsor, which didn't previously exist. And then lastly, just to give you another one, District 12 in Manchester. This is another one where the current rep, his street is the border of the District 12. So you can see there's and these are just 5 examples, but there are more than that. But I think these are ones where I found that were the closest maybe to the borders or had to stretch into another town to make it work. But these are a couple examples of, you know, very intentional street by street level carving of making these reps street where they live on, making it the border to protect their districts, right? And as Mark mentioned, right, I mean, we can definitely have those conversations of, is that great for democracy, you know, to really protect these people's jobs, right? Is that what we're trying to do? And so I just want to, you know, spend another minute or two quickly just talk about my class, because I think, like it was mentioned, I mean, this is something I created a couple years back, and this semester has definitely been the most interesting and exciting, just given the timing of the process, where my students have been able to be actively engaged in the process. And so here's a few different things that we did. You know, so again, I turned this into a semester-long course that's a math class and a political science class at the same time, where we get to sort of go back and forth between, you know, mathematical methods, court cases, you know, different processes across the country. And then, of course, we have been focusing more on Connecticut issues. But we did a postcard campaign for League of Women Voters. We did a lot of map submissions to the Reapportionment Commission, which make up a lot of the gallery that Common Cause put together. We were a part of writing a redistricting preview series that is on the League of Women Voters People Power Fair Maps campaign blog post, where you can see our students compiled regional previews for the House and the Senate maps. We also participated in a national competition of Map Across America. One of my students was one of the winners of this competition. And we're also currently working on a local redistricting project, which we're really excited about and hope to have finalized or drafted in the next couple of weeks, which we want to provide a public resource that really doesn't exist in terms of what we found, that compiles all of the local government structures for all the 169 town governments, and also creates a resource where we can see on one page on the town level. You know, we've talked about congressional, state house, state senate, but there are also some of our towns in Connecticut that do redistrict their towns because their towns don't vote everybody at large at town council, right? And so we have found that there's about 20 so far towns in Connecticut that have their own town level districts. And we want to create a public resource that compiles this for everybody. So we've done a lot of work on this, and we hope to have this sort of finalized as well. So we're really excited about that. And like I said, the overall goal is just really empower them, you know, to feel like they're a part of that process. And, you know, it's exciting for, you know, these students who are coming in, you know, obviously, you know, 18 to 21 years old. And now they are changing what happens when they Google themselves and they're finding their testimonies on the Connecticut website for the Connecticut Reapportionment Commission. So it's making them feel more empowered and feel like, you know, of course, they know what they're doing, right? And they know, you know, how to draw these things in the program, what they're looking for, how to analyze it, and that it makes a difference in our political process. So that's been really fun. So, and again, thank you for having me here tonight.
There we go. Thank you, Kyle. It's just amazing. And I know we'll get to touch a little bit more on this throughout some of the questions. It really is amazing. Thank you. Cheri Quickmire is up next, and Cheri joined Common Cause in 2009 and is responsible for all aspects of organizational, board development, and policy work in Connecticut. She has more than 2 decades of experience as an activist, organizer, and administrator. Prior to joining Common Cause, Cheri served as executive director of One Connecticut, a statewide coalition of 100 organizations working to make the state tax structure more stable and equitable. Cheri was also a policy analyst for the Connecticut Association for Human Services and led initiatives to support opportunity and prosperity for low-income state residents. If you're not familiar with Common Cause, if you Google it, if you look at anything, the list goes on. It's amazing how many topics that you work with and deal with for all our benefits. So thank you very much. We're very happy to have you here, Cheri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle or Bryce, and thank you for the invitation. I have learned a tremendous amount. I mean, I always learn a lot from Mark and Ken every time I listen to them or read what they write. But it's my first time getting to hear anything of Professor Evans' presentation, so I've learned a lot there. That's for certain. And I think that we and the league, I will speak for the league only briefly, but we'll say that there was a considerable amount of disappointment in the process of how this all came together. There was very little opportunity for public input. The part of that had to do with COVID, part of that had to do with just how we went from a committee to a commission, how the data came in late. I mean, there were all these reasons that everybody could point to. But the reality is that people did not have the opportunity to do more than testify minimally. I mean, the one hearing that I went to at the Legislative Office building where I testified, there were 3 people testifying. I was testifying, the woman who was the president of the League of Women Voters, and then some random guy who had been making maps. And I don't remember his name, I apologize, but that was it. And the other hearings were very similar, and with the exception of the Zoom hearing that was held, which was dominated by the residents of Wilton who wanted to talk ad nauseum, in my feeling, about how they did not see themselves as part of Norwalk and they shouldn't have to have anything to do with Norwalk. And oh my God, who thought of that? So there were just really not opportunities for people to comment other than submitting written testimony, which might or might not get read by anyone on the commission. So I think that we were disappointed that residents were not consulted more about their communities, about what they thought communities should look like, could look like, what were the challenges there, and what were the economic communities or the cultural communities, and how did they think they wanted to be grouped or represented? And that did not happen. There was also no adequate translation in Spanish for anyone to encourage additional people to participate, Spanish-speaking people in particular, although we have many language groups in the state, they're the most likely to have been encouraged. There was also no translation for people who are hearing impaired. And so there was no opportunity for folks to participate in that way. And there was no opportunity to see drafts of maps being put together. Nobody saw anything that wasn't behind a closed door. And there was no chance to say, well, that just seems like a crazy gerrymander there, and what in the world does that long tail have to do with that district? And it would have everything to do with what was just being described as, the district where it was drawn up to accommodate the new house that the state rep bought, and she wanted to still be in the district, as one example. And that's that is not a way to really think about this, in my estimation. And I think that the fact that none of the internal meetings were public, no deliberations that they were making were public. Anytime we got to see them in public, it was for a 10-minute meeting. And they had already made all the decisions they were going to make behind closed doors. And then they came together and said, okay, this is what we're going to do. And everybody wants to vote, and everybody voted, and it was over. And 10 minutes, I think, was the maximum time that the commission meetings actually happened. So that was extremely disappointing and absolutely unnecessary. There's plenty of opportunity to do hearings on Zoom and for people to participate, for them to put out the information and give people that opportunity. And there was, in the first committee that was working on this, the chair of the committee spent a lot of time encouraging people to use the public apps that were available to draw maps. And he made a big point of saying that you can, in fact, describe how you want your district to look or how you think it should look, and submit that to the committee. Now, mind you, very few people did that, and I'm very happy that Professor Evans had the opportunity to get his students to do that. We held 2 public opportunities to do map making, one in New Haven and one in Waterbury, and it was so difficult to get people to participate. People were just very nervous about it. They were sure they didn't know how to do it. We had an expert come in and Zoom with people to describe how it is to use the various apps. But they still were very, very nervous because they didn't want to be submitting something to a professional commission full of state legislators. We did get a number of people to submit them, not as many people as came out and actually did mapping. So that was very difficult because they could not see the committee meetings. They could not acclimate to the whole idea other than in discussion with us. And that made it very complicated for them. And I mean, we didn't go all around the state. I mean, people weren't comfortable also coming out in public and doing this. And we did one in a restaurant that was outside, and everybody felt comfortable because we were outside the whole time eating pizza. That seemed to be a real draw. But other than that, people did not really have a chance to say what it is they thought could be done. And when these districts have been drawn, there was no written explanation. And it was up to people like Mark and Ken to say, oh, well, this happened because of that. And to see Professor Evans' map where, Map Blumenthal is like sitting right on the edge of his district. People don't know that. People wouldn't have seen that. And it was, thankfully, there were people who were making public some of those discussions, but, it was after the fact and after they'd already voted on the districts for the most part. So that, I think there's a lot to be said for citizen redistricting commissions that are in place in a number of different states. And frankly, I'm a little tired of hearing from our commission members and leadership that, oh, well, we have a much better system because we're half Republican, half Democrat. And so therefore, we've got it all under control. It reminds me of that meeting that the league held at the Yale Law School a couple of years ago, where there were all these luminaries from Brennan Center and all these various people talking about redistricting and why this was so important and why people needed to engage and how this needed to be done in a way that was transparent and available, accessible. And so they went through everybody, and at the very end, the Senate minority leader and the Senate majority leader, the president of the Senate, stood up and said, I don't know, I think it works really well. Don't you think it works really well? They've been in office forever, and this is working very well to keep it as incumbent protection for them. Now, I'm not saying that's their entire, impulse to make it happen, but I am saying it does work for them. Yes, they're right. So I think we need to look carefully in this state at other models to see, what can and may or may not work better. Because I think that this is every 10-year opportunity to shine some light on how it is that we have a process that really informs our democracy. And I think it doesn't happen often enough to really make that as accessible to voters and to residents of the state. But I think it's an opportunity that we're missing again this time around. I'm very pleased that we eliminated gerrymandering that related to the prison population. That was a very long time coming and a lot of work making that happen. But I think it's an extremely important measure. One more way to get rid of some of the Jim Crow vestige of the past, and I'm very pleased with that. So I'm sure there are questions, but I'm kind of rambling, I can tell.
Thank you. No, you weren't rambling.
Smiles.
One thing I want to start with is that one of the issues with redistricting is that it happens every 10 years. So that we get all like ramped up about it. We don't really get to participate in it. We may be appalled by some of the results and whatever, and then it's a 10-year gap. So it goes away. It's not sexy, it's done, and there's 10 years for this to happen and whatever. So the question I want to start with, and we've got plenty to dig down deeper or whatever, but what's the best way to transform the existing systems to disallow politicians from picking their own voters and incumbents? And what can we do now? I mean, I don't want to wait 10 years and be having the same conversations. That's just me personally, but and anybody can answer. So this is open to all of you.
No, I'll jump in because one of the problems that you have is this is a window that opens every 10 years. It's open relatively briefly, and then it closes. So when Cheri mentioned the prison gerrymandering issue, that's something that could develop from session to session. It was a very different process. You had the ability, first off, you were identifying real people who were affected and tying it to specific communities, and you could make the case. But as she noted, that took several years. The problem with this is when the League and when Common Cause point out the shortcomings of the process, it's a very ephemeral thing. It's a political brigadoon. It appears and then it disappears.
Right.
And in the absence of some continuing controversy, if you had a situation where a Black community was disenfranchised as a result of a map drawn, and then that turned into a multi-year effort to rectify that, that absent that, I don't see how you're going to change this process that comes up every 10 years. One of the other shortcomings to me is it's a more practical matter. These are the legislative leaders who at the end are all doing it. They have other demands on their time to do the kind of analysis. For example, Professor Evans's class, they have produced maps that I've looked at a bunch of them, and a lot of them are fairly politically sophisticated. It's not just a question of the math, but they are good. They respect the what I think everybody recognizes as the geographic centers of the 5 congressional districts, for example. And then, the maps they did actually reflect sort of the political balance of power, that in Western Connecticut and in Eastern Connecticut, those are going to be the competitive areas, and then the other three, less so. But anyway, that's my observation about trying to change this process. It is something that only is before the public and even the advocates once every 10 years. That is always going to be a very difficult environment to make change.
But does that mean we shouldn't try?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all.
No,
But as a strategy, what you need fuel. You need things that will feed it, things that will keep it going. Now, this year, again, it's hard to judge it because the pandemic affected it as well. But even in the absence of the pandemic, this is a very difficult process for the public to crack. And, the League and Common Cause, you were trying to do something that arguably should have been done 2 years ago when you talk about process, right? And if you're talking about even more radical change about taking it out of the legislature and giving it to some other body, that would take, I think, a long time to make that case. In North Carolina, they have made changes because in North Carolina, they had these outrageous maps that were politically unfair. They also disadvantaged minorities, and you did have a grassroots effort and that some prominent people helped lead, including, I think the former head of the University of North Carolina system. And so you need that kind of outrage as an organizing principle, because that's just sort of how politics, works. So no, I'm not saying it's not important to pursue it, but if you are going to pursue it, you have to start early and you have to think of a way to make the case and engage larger segments of the public. Because even though, as Professor Evans's students show, that given the apps that are available, with a little bit of training, you can quickly do these things. But as Cheri learned, it's hard to, again, excite the imagination of the public, absent, again, if you had a growing Latino population or a Black population somewhere, and the districts were drawn in a way to really keep those communities from electing somebody, absent that, it's again, hard to get people fired up about it.
You can start by knowing who your state rep and state senator is. That would be an excellent place to start if you want to get active.
What about transparency? I mean, that's one of the questions here. And Cheri, you spoke about it. There's been extremely short notice of public meetings or opportunity for public comments. Should the public see and discuss the maps before they're voted on? And would that have made an impact on the resulting maps? If people have to defend that they drew this map to include the new house, of an incumbent or someone they want, wouldn't that help us bring all this out in the open? I mean, there is no transparency. This has been done
and that's
behind
concrete.
closed doors for a long time.
Right, that's concrete. You could have a reasonable hearing. The hearings they had were in the abstract, by and large. So yes, if you put the maps out and there was a comment period, but the problem, and I don't mean a problem for democracy or a problem for the citizens, but it's a problem for the practitioners. If you put out a map in the House, 151 districts, the 4 people on that commission are going to spend the next 10 days, 20 days dealing with 151 members plus potential challenges about the ins and outs of those districts. There's nothing wrong with that in the abstract, but as a practical matter, that's what they're trying to avoid, which is why none of these maps were put forward for a public hearing. It's a little bit like the budget. The budget does have a hearing, but ultimately when they cut the deal, they vote on it as quickly as possible under the rules, because the longer it sits there, the more people can see, well, wait a minute, Representative so-and-so got X, Y, Z, or that group got it. And that's, and that's what will happen with this hearings. And again, I think there's a very strong argument to do it that way and just deal with the messiness. But that would be the only way, absent some really radical change about a new type of commission. But just simply to do that, to have a real comment period when the maps are drawn and the ones that they intend to vote on, as opposed to just they came out and we saw them as they voted on it.
Oh. I think that a couple of other states have tried things like getting the maps from the whoever the commission was, and blowing them up and posting them so that people could actually see them and comment. But when I suggested that to the House Majority Leader, he said, "Oh, is that what we're supposed to do?" He goes, "Oh, I've never done this before." I said, "Absolutely, that would be a great idea." But it didn't happen, of course. But it does seem like a good idea. They posted them in City Hall in a couple of different towns. This was in Maryland. And, so people could actually take a look. But these were not draft maps, which would be my suggestion. Give people an opportunity to see some drafts before you actually have the finished maps already out. But knowing how it works at least in the House, there's an office in the House with someone who's been doing this work for 30 years, and there's no big surprise that they came out with a map when they did, and it happened.
Well, I think it's difficult to talk about public hearings on something like this when you can't see it. Like, I don't know if it affects me until I see a map, and I don't know, I haven't had a chance to determine if that's good or bad or whatever. So I think we've taken the public hearing portion kind of out of it if you don't have that. And Kyle, you're able to do analysis of maps after the fact. I mean, you guys create your own and whatever, and you use all the communities of interest and different things you can overlay and come up with things. But we always seem like we're looking at things after the fact, and now we've got 10 more years. So what do you think any legislators would ever ask you in advance or to help with maps or to help be part of this process, something like that?
No, unless it would serve their interests. So, I mean, going back to that previous discussion, I mean, in all honesty, good luck asking them to pass something that affects their job status, right? So, and just to give a small example, because I thought it was kind of funny, when they passed the prison gerrymandering law back in May, the state Senate vote on this was 35-1. You could probably guess that the one person who voted against this contained multiple state prisons in his district. So, that's just where we're at, right, in the process. And so, this is, I don't remember who said this recently, but, I think I read it's like the one thing that Republicans and Democrats seem to agree on in this state is that they want to keep their jobs, right? And so that seems to be the challenge. Yes, ideally, it would be nice to do some of these things ahead of time, where you don't even consider incumbent addresses or, these other things, or political data or whatever, like some states try to do. Of course, that would be great, but this isn't the reality that we are living in this state's process.
One of the things that really illustrates the difficulty in doing this. So, you're talking about trying to have, John Q. Public and, be involved. Well, in the 90th House District, that was the one that was redrawn so that Jim Jinks, who lost by 7 votes to Craig Fishbein, he was districted out of that district. And the Cheshire, that was in Cheshire, the Cheshire Democratic Town Committee town chair was outraged that this happened. And she was totally surprised. Well, the Democratic town chair of Cheshire works for the Senate Democrats, and she's hip deep in reapportionment on the Senate side. So to hear her outrage about what the House did, it was a little rich. And because the Senate that she works for was not exactly inviting people in to get a peek before they did their map. But again, my point is, even if you were an insider, even if you're in the building, it is so hard to anticipate some of this stuff. And that one, but that was also an example of, if that had been put to a public hearing, that would have been a massive controversy. The idea that in a race that had been settled by 7 votes, the district was being redrawn to make it favor one party. And that probably wouldn't have survived, nor should it have, quite frankly.
When you're talking about in the news, and you can be part of that, how do you rank the importance of redistricting when prioritizing the news? Does the quickly moving news cycle prevent more in-depth coverage or long-term coverage of a topic like redistricting?
Well, if it's done behind closed doors, there's not much you can do besides just make daily phone calls in between you're chasing after the governor for the latest COVID story. Yeah, if they had, I went to a couple of the public hearings, and they had people from Wilton came out to Shelton. They made their voices heard. Derby kind of was split between, gee, it's good to have 3 members of the House, or it's not good to have 3 members of the House for you. Yeah.
There were probably 3 or 4 reporters who really put effort into it. That reflects how the media is shrunk, but it also reflects that this is a fairly esoteric thing. And again, absent a good human interest story, about, a Puerto Rican neighborhood being really disenfranchised, it can be pretty dry, even though it's hugely important. But that was part of the feedback I got when the people I were talking to, they were happy to talk to me, because they said, there were not going to be a lot of reporters trying to cover it, quite frankly.
One of the questions asked about the importance of the census, and how do we get the populace to understand the importance of the census and how those numbers are critical to how we will be governed over the next 10 years. And although it's important, I'm saying that it's less important than some of the other things, but I'd like you to comment on the census and the importance of that.
The census, to avoid the undercount in the urban areas, it's the same difficulty in getting people to turn out to vote. These are neighborhoods where there's a lot of movement, very, very transitory, a lot of poverty, education levels low, connectivity to the web, and the census this time relied on the web to a degree it never had before, although they did do the canvassing. But all these things add up together to districts where, the districts that you're going to have a bad return the first time around. Connecticut seemed to do a pretty good job in reaching out there, but there is the suspicion, and of course, with the Trump administration really saber rattling about immigrants, that added to the distress that we're seeing increasingly in government, particularly among minority groups, and more particularly among immigrant groups. So all of that was, that was a challenge this time.
Well, it was, we used to have 6 members of the Congress here. It wasn't that long ago. 20 years ago is a generation, but that's one less Democrat in Washington. You can almost explain that to people in a close vote. But yeah, Mark and I are old enough to remember that. Six reps.
6 reps that were evenly divided at one point, three Democrats, 3 Republicans. And people also forget that when we had that new map with only 5, for the first two cycles, it was 3-2 Republican. You know, that seems like a million years ago, given that the Republicans
Wow.
haven't won, anything since 2006.
I was just going to say that I think your both points you were making, that both of you were making, are really important. But I have to say, I don't see the parties or advocates really taking on the challenge of the canvassing, the reaching out to neighborhoods, to speaking with people about what's going on. I mean, it's incredibly time consuming, and in the year of COVID, where people are afraid to open their doors and you're afraid to knock on their doors, it's a bigger challenge. And as you say, with the transitory nature of the communities, everybody's got a cell phone. Nobody's got the cell phone number to call. So you don't know, where you're going, who you're talking to. It's very difficult to do that. And so it's hard for people who don't live right there to get a real sense of what the neighborhood is like, or what that community larger is like. So I think that advocates and parties need to do a much better job of dealing with that. And I don't know when we can do that, when everybody's vaccinated. I don't even know. When will that feel safe to do?
One question I think we've already talked about, though, is why has redistricting always been behind closed doors? It almost seems like we've answered that.
I think we have.
So the last question here, and I'd like you to comment: has mainstream news suffered from political correctness? Can't we call a lie a lie? Shouldn't we? Shouldn't there be some outrage?
I'm not sure the relevance to redistricting on that, but
Well,
I mean, go ahead.
no, just they're
No,
outraged in any way, but has it?
It has, look, the rules of the game have changed, and largely because of President Trump. I mean, you've seen it nationally. As reporters, we were always trained to be very careful about accusing somebody of lying, because that implies the intent, what they actually believed. Now, in the case of President Trump, when there were instances where he repeated a statement when it was demonstrated quite clearly, and that's when you saw the media actually change the rules of the game, including, august publications, like the New York Times, where you would see the word lie in a headline. And, I've been doing this 40 years, and I was astonished that we've got to the point where you would see a headline referring to the President of the United States fairly routinely referred to as lying. So the media is doing that more, but I think most of us are fairly cautious about doing so. You are trying to lay out the facts. You are trying to maintain your credibility with different groups, which is becoming increasingly challenging. There's such polarization and such a fracturing of where people get their news and whatnot. It does become very difficult.
Mark, how about that public hearing in government administration and elections when a certain senator was spinning a tale about voter fraud that never happened? What was the verb you used?
I don't remember. I do remember the feedback I had with that senator after what I wrote. No, I mean, we do. You do try to fact check, and again, you can fact check without calling somebody a liar. You can point out certain things. Sometimes that's too subtle. Oftentimes, I think it's clear enough if you lay out the facts. Somebody makes a claim, and then you point out what is known in the public record. And Ken is referring to a senator who had a very compelling story about something that happened in one of the towns about voting. And then when I made phone calls to there, it was hard to really get a version that backed him up. I'll leave it at that.
Well, there were dozens of cases of complaints filed on voter fraud in the State Elections Enforcement Commission, and they were subsequently turned away one after another, thrown out. That was part of peripheral to that. So,
Well,
yeah.
thrown out and ridiculed. I mean, your story may, I mean, those decisions, because you could sense the frustration and the waste of time in elections enforcement.
And money.
But no, I mean, that's that's another area, it's sort of the claims of voter fraud. And, I wrote a story in November after the election, and it just because it seemed to answer a question that people would pose on the web, it got a huge audience. But it was, it was a story that was headlined, "Voter fraud is real," just not in the way that President Trump thinks. It's not scalable. It certainly does exist, and it can tilt a local race, but again, it's the way our election, we don't have a national election. We have 50 elections, and then you subdivide those into counties, and this would be a very difficult system to fix. And if anybody spends any time looking at it, they would not be persuaded that this could be fixed. You have a president of the United States who was trying to make the case that votes were counted electronically and these things could be hacked. And that's not how it worked. Even in the places that were using some of these digital machines, they were really producing paper records that were then scanned. So there was a paper trail for all this stuff. But again, we're getting a little bit afield. Because I'll be happy to participate on a panel about voter fraud someday.
Okay. Any other comments on redistricting to finish off the night? I'd be happy to hear from any of you. Nope.
Well, I just want to say that I appreciate the work that all of you have done to bring this to light as much as can be expected. And I'm sorry that we couldn't make it as more compelling to folks to get more engaged in the process. But I think that even if you didn't call that senator a liar to his face, I'm sure you can hang on to that concept, because I'm sure it'll come up again. And I think that if we really want a democracy that works for everyone, then we're going to have to do more calling people out. I think being, nonpartisan doesn't mean that you don't call out a lie when you see it.
Any last comments? Anybody? Well, from the league, from the library, I'd like to thank you all. You're absolutely compelling speakers and interesting topic. And I think we brought a little bit more awareness to the public, and we look forward to hearing more in the future. So thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, everyone, for
Thanks,
coming.
everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.